All right, let's talk about fallacies. Fallacies are inaccurate or intentionally misleading misapplications of logic. Okay, those are a lot of big words. What does logical fallacies really mean? Logical fallacies mean that you're trying to trick the audience into believing what you're saying. That you're twisting the words, you're twisting the examples, you're using things to change the way that it looks to the audience. Okay. And I think that you have to be very careful with logical fallacies because the problem with it is, first off, if you are relying on a fallacy to get your point across, it means that you're using bad information. That's an issue. But the other part of it is that if the audience believes that you're doing this, you've lost their trust. And one of the key elements in persuasion is building that relationship with the audience, building that trust with your audience, showing them this is what I believe and why I believe, and this is what I want you to do. And if they feel that you are being misleading, you're being devious, you're being untruthful, you're being not fair, you've lost that trust. And so what you really want to think about is how that's going to come across to your audience, okay? So the thing about logical fallacies that you need to be aware of is, first off, that some of them, just because you see a fallacy in a source doesn't mean that the source is necessarily bad. You just want to be very aware of this so that you don't do it in your paper. And when you see it in sources, you kind of get a sense of what they were doing and why, and then you can better evaluate if that's a source that you want to use. So I want to walk you through some different fallacies. These are some of the more common ones. It is not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but these are just some of the more common ones that we get into. The first one is the false dichotomy. This is the either or, the take it or leave it, right? If you aren't part of the solution, you're part of the problem. The problem with this is that you present the audience with two choices. Your choice, the one that you're trying to persuade people on, and something that is so obviously wrong, so obviously bad that the audience would never, ever go for it. And therefore, their only other option is what you have, right? The problem is that in most situations, there's many, 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 many different options. For instance, when you go in and the doctor says, okay, we got to do blank. This surgery, this operation, this procedure, this treatment, this whatever. Well, you need to ask yourself, is that the only option? Are there other options that I can do? Are there other treatment things? Do I need a second or a third opinion? Do I need to really evaluate some of these different things? So the either or fallacy, the false dichotomy fallacy. The next one, and this is the most common one that you're going to see, is the ad hominem attack, or attacking the person instead of the information. Okay, directing attack at the character of who is saying it or producing this versus directing an attack on the information itself. You would say that you're a crazy liberal tree hugger. So the problem of this is that it really becomes an emotional thing and it really shuts down a discussion. I think that this is also a very common fallacy that you'll see because this is what your audience is going to do for you or do at you or against you, because they are going to, it is always easier for me to judge you, the speaker, than your ideas. To evaluate your ideas, I have to research, back it up, verify it, internalize it, and then agree or disagree with it. Or I can make a snap judgment about you. You didn't have a good delivery. You were using bad language. Maybe your delivery style wasn't acceptable. Maybe that this source doesn't seem really good. You were using bad kinds of sources, or you're using fallacies, right? And so I can look at you and say, yeah, I don't trust you, therefore I don't trust anything that you're saying. An example of this might be Bill Clinton was a bad president because he was an unfaithful husband. There is some relationship between that, probably. I mean, this idea of trust and faithfulness, there may be some connection. But really, realistically, I mean, one doesn't equate the other, right? And so when people get emotionally engaged on this one topic, then they just transfer it over to the president. Maybe a more recent example is David Hogg. And people didn't necessarily like the message that he was promoting, about gun safety and gun regulation and different kinds of gun laws. So they said, no, look at him at this speech. He looks like he's giving the Hitler sign. Or how come a high school senior wears a sports jacket every year? Or why didn't he get into Harvard? Or his dad was an FBI agent, so therefore he was a plant and he was this was a crisis actor. They were attacking him, not necessarily his ideas. The non sequitur, this is a faulty cause and effect relationship where you try to make a connection between a cause and an effect that isn't necessarily there. For instance, this car has a noisy engine, therefore it must be fast. Well, if you go to a NASCAR race, yeah, obviously those are loud cars. But is the noise a function of the speed? Or is it because of something else, right? Because I drink a 6-pack a day, sexy young chicks will come flocking to me. That's every beer commercial out there, right? Or if you build it, they will come. We're going to build this auditorium and everybody's going to flock to it because, all these different artists are going to want to come and perform in that. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to make a connection between things that may or may not actually exist. Take this screenshot of a commercial from Swiffer. This ad here isn't saying, look at how great this cleans. Partially, that's what it does. But it's saying, look, if you use Swiffer, you can live this kind of life. And look at that house. I mean, it's very modern. It's very big. Look at that huge, giant, what is that, 6, 8, 10, it's a 8, 10-foot window, right? The whole wall is a window, right? Think about what it's doing there. It's selling that image. It's saying that if you use Swiffer, you can have this kinds of lifestyle. The hasty generalization is where you make a jump. You jump to a conclusion from a statistically insufficient or biased samples. Most of the people in this room are opposed to the project, therefore probably everyone else in the town is as well. Well, maybe, but maybe not, because, who shows up to meetings, right? The people that are really emotionally engaged, they're really upset about it. If it's a project that looks like it's going to go through, the people that support it probably aren't going to show up or not nearly the same numbers. The people that are upset about it, they're the ones that are really going to get emotionally engaged. The key down here is obviously the absence of proof doesn't necessarily make it true. For instance, when we look at this picture, are we saying that, what are we saying about this? Like, you look at the age of the woman, the wrinkles in the face, and then the cigarette. Could we realistically jump to the conclusion that smoking caused this? Which is what a lot of anti-smoking commercials might do. And so what it is that we're trying to not necessarily see all the information, we just make a snap decision. Now, circular reasoning, this one's kind of once you see it in action, it makes sense, right? The standard written English that you will learn in this course is defined as the writing style most people employed by college-educated people. Well, but if you're in college class, you're going to see that writing, but that writing is by the people that go to college, but the people that go to college are the ones that produce stuff for college. So, you think about how you use the definition as the example, and the example as the definition. For instance, Chick-fil-A must be popular because there's long lines. I mean, you think about the Chick-fil-A on the east side, and they get wrapped around that building a couple different times, right? Is it because that is so popular that people want to go there and they want to wait in line? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait a minute, that must be a great place because there's so many people in that line, and they just keep adding to that line. They keep jumping into that line, which is kind of just keeps making it almost like a feedback loop, right? Let's take a look at the red herring. The red herring is where you try to confuse the main issue by throwing out something that's distracting. Maybe it gets people to move from the main idea to a subpoint or a smaller side issue that isn't nearly as important or as persuasive. If I hadn't done it, someone else would have. So it's really not my fault, right? Or I work 60 hours a week to support my family and I pay my taxes. You can't arrest me because I punched him in the face. Well, what does working 60 hours a week have to do with an assault, right? And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to just cloud things up, or you're trying to get people to buy into a side issue that kind of gets them off onto the side. For instance, if you look at the last presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, yes, I'm very embarrassed by it. I hate it, but it's locker room talk. This is Donald Trump talking. And it's one of these things. I will knock the hell out of ISIS. We're going to defeat ISIS. ISIS happened a number of years ago in a vacuum that was left because of bad judgment. And I will tell you, I take care of ISIS. Wait a minute. We went from a talk about some of his language that he had used on the Access Hollywood tapes to ISIS. Well, most people are going to agree that, yeah, ISIS is bad and we want something to do with ISIS. But you made this big jump from one topic to another, and it's distracting. It gets people off task, and it gets people away from the issue that you don't want to necessarily address. Begging the question, building upon hidden assumptions. Again, this one is kind of a difficult one in theory, but once you see it in action, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? Why did you stop beating your spouse? Well, I'm assuming that you have a spouse or that you were beating him to begin with. Okay, so what happens is with begging the question is that we're just asking you to ask that next question. And if you don't, what does it really say? For instance, so if a cop sits out on the side of a road and with the radar gun and doesn't catch anybody speeding, does that mean that nobody speeds on that road? Right? Or is it because they see them and they slow down and then get around the curve and they speed back up again, right? And so this idea that you're making assumptions that you're not necessarily walking them all the way through. The slippery slope, which is one of the fallacies that we talk a lot about. This is a very common one. This is where you create a series of events that once this progression starts, you cannot stop it. And it always ends in something really bad. For instance, first medicinal wine from a teaspoon, then beer from a bottle, soon you're an alcoholic. Or if you ban assault rifles, what are you going to take away next? BB guns and water pistols? And that is probably the idea behind most gun arguments, or a lot of arguments, gun in particular, that once you start at this level, you're going to go to this level, and this level, and this level, and this level. One of the things about slippery slopes which make it really difficult to deal with is that any one step makes sense. I mean, you can buy into that. But if you look at all the steps from beginning to end, then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, there's no way that, I would ever buy into this. I would never allow this to start.